The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hey, good morning, everyone. This is Travis McGrath from Exago. Thank you for joining us on today's support lab. Today we're doing a technical lab. We're going to dive into parameters, which are sort of like, the nuts and bolts of Exago. They're a great tool that enables folks integrating Exago to do really cool things with some of the other extensibility features, and they can also be used by end users. So before I begin, again, just thanks for coming. My colleagues Emma and Nick are going to be monitoring questions. So everyone's on mute, but if you do have questions, of course, we love getting them as we present. So if you have any questions, just type in the right panel. And if you could go ahead and in the webinar panel, just type a Y or a yes, thumbs up, something to let us know that you can hear everything okay and see the screen. It should say, Exago Support Lab. All right, looks good, coming through loud and clear, perfect. So today's gonna be a pretty quick lab. So what we're gonna do on today's agenda is go through some quick definitions and notes, and then getting past sort of the textbook stuff, we're gonna look at some practical examples, some end user focused examples, and some technical examples, but we won't spend too much time in code. The other disclaimer here is that parameters have a wide array of uses. So I'm going to look at these three examples and then I'll mention some other uses, but we won't do a deep dive on every use because parameters are so broadly applicable. Okay, so with that, what are parameters? I've sort of buried that there. So a parameter is an object in Exago that serves as a placeholder for a value. Generally, those values are stored by the host application. So if you've joined us on some of our support labs where we talk about the API or integration, if the host app wants to store a value for a user, they can use a parameter to do so. Those values can be set by the API. They can also be defined by a user, and we'll see that in just a moment. Some important notes. So parameters are case sensitive. If you're using them in formulas or in code, that really matters. If you use the wrong case, it won't find the parameter you're looking for. Parameters can be hidden from the user, as most of them are, but you can also set parameters to be non-hidden or set the hidden property to false, in which case a parameter can be used on a report. And we're going to see that in a bit. And if a parameter is used on a report, you can actually have it prompt a user for a value before that report executes. Again, we'll show what that looks like in real time. So before I jump into some examples, I just want to pause, see if there are any questions right up front about parameters. Okay, great. So with that, the first example is actually going to be sort of just a how do we build parameters example. And what I want to do there is look at two parameters Exago recommends everyone integrating Exago create to keep track of who the user is. And in fact, these two parameters, user ID and company ID, and I want to stress here the I in both cases is capital. Like we said, parameters being case sensitive, this matters a lot. These two parameters specifically, Exago is going to look for to identify the user. And it's going to use that and keep track of that information for things like scheduled reports and folder management. We just did a support lab on folder management last month, and we saw the use of these parameters being passed to folder management methods to let the extensibility, the folder management, know who the user is. Similarly, with schedules, when a user schedules a report, the user ID and the company ID are going to be stored. So let's look at that as a practical example. So what I'm going to do is jump over to our administration console in Exago. And under the data in the left of the main menu here on the left, we see parameters. Now to add a parameter, just like everything else in this menu, you can right click or select it and hit add. You'll notice I have a long list of parameters already available. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to open up to edit my user ID and company ID parameters. These might not be here by default for you. If they're not, we definitely recommend you make them here. So parameter has a couple of key properties. The name, that's going to be that case-sensitive way of identifying a parameter. Parameters have types. They can be strings or text, dates, integers, and decimals, and then values. Those are the first three basic properties. And for the case of user ID and company ID, those are the only ones we care about. Now, I have set some defaults here. This is a GUID to identify my user, and then of course my value for company ID is probably just the name of my company. But the key part here is that as a user logs in, these values will be changed for that user for that specific session through the API. So there's not a lot of use case for this first example, just that these parameters should exist in your environment, and if they don't, you should definitely create them or talk to your administrator and make sure that they're created. In a moment, we'll look at these parameters, hidden, prompt text, and the others. So jumping back here. So that's our first case, just this simple, how do we create parameters and that you should create these user ID and company ID parameters. The second case is a little more hands-on. So what we want to do is look at how a user can take advantage of a non-hidden parameter. The scenario is we've built a dashboard with 3 reports. Each report has a filter on a different date field. So some data on a date is filtering a report or a series of reports. And we want the user to be able to select a single date and have it apply to all those filters on the dashboard. So I'm going to jump over to our front end here. And I've created a folder with 3 reports. And what I can do is I can see that these are, by their title, similar but different reports, right? Orders made on a specific date, orders required on a date, and orders shipped on a date. And maybe I want to see all 3 of those metrics for a specific date. Now I can edit a report. The report looks very simple, right? It's just a title and a couple of formulas, no big deal here. But if I go to my filter menu, I see that this report is filtering on shipped date. So this is one particular data field. Now, if I look at the order object in general, I have order date and required date. And so I'm going to make an educated guess that these 2 other reports are going to also have values here. So what I want to do is take this filter and provide a value here that I don't want to select a specific value. And normally I would just say prompt for value, but if I prompt for value on ship date and on my other reports I use prompt for value as well, since those are different fields, when a user runs the dashboard, they're going to have to select the same date 3 times. So instead, in our admin console, we're going to use a new parameter, or we can take advantage of an existing parameter. So in this case, I already have the parameter built. So I'm going to call this as of date, right? I want to run this report as of this specific date, but you can call this really whatever you want. So maybe just, filter date or order date, whatever you want to call it here. I can change its type. And here I have it as a string. Might make more sense here for it to be a date. Either way, no problem. Its value, I could enter a default value here, or you can use an Exago formula. So in this case, I've entered today, so that when the report prompts, the default value will just give it today's date. Now, here's where I can change whether or not a user can take advantage of this parameter. So the hidden property is going to be set to false. Once it's set to false, a user can add a parameter to a report or to a filter, and it will provide a value. But going one step further, I'm going to set a prompt text. Normally, the prompt text on a parameter is just blank, but if you set a parameter's hidden value to false, and you give it prompt text, then if it's used on a report, it will prompt the user for a value. And I'll show you what that looks like in just a second. So with this parameter in place, we're going to come back here, and in our filter menu, we're going to type, or in this case, I'm just going to paste from my clipboard, the parameter. And what we're going to do is we're going to put it between @ symbols. So this is how a user can add a parameter to a report or to a filter. They put it between @ symbols. And as we mentioned before, parameters are case sensitive. So in this case, I have capital A, O, and D in as update. So I'm going to click OK here. And when I go to run the report, I notice that the first thing that happens is a parameters dialog appears. I see my prompt text here. This matches what was entered in the admin console. And I'm given, in this case, a string with today's date, and I can select a value here. Now, if I had said that this parameter was a date, I would get my nice calendar dropdown like I'm used to there as well. So I'm not going to run the report just yet. So I want to pause there and see if you have any questions on adding a parameter to a filter. Looks like a question came in. Is it better to use a string or date? Great question. So the question was, is it better here to set the parameter to be a string or a date? In this case, I would actually recommend setting it as a date. I think this was probably an oversight on my part. And the reason having a date here is better is because when it prompts, you'll get a calendar icon on the right, like you would with, say, a date filter. Right, so you get a calendar dropdown just like this. Okay, so I've got this prompting, and I'm just going to tell you that I've gone ahead and added the same style of filter using a prompting parameter to each of the other reports. But on my dashboard, I want to display that, and I want it to be nicely formatted. So what I'm going to do is edit another report. Again, this looks very similar. It's a title and some formulas. I have a filter here on order date with my parameter. But in this case, I've added an extra column. So this one's going to give us some labels for our dashboard. And what you'll notice at the top is I've used the parameter inside of a formula. What that's going to let us do is format the value on the report. So it displays. We've given it some nice background color. And you'll even notice if I open our formula editor, it's syntactically checked. So if I were to say use a lowercase letter here, it would say, hey, wait, parameters are case sensitive, right? So you can use a parameter inside of a formula on your report, again, if it's set to be non-hidden. And in this case, we have some formatting so that the date will appear as we want it on the report. So then the last thing I want to do here is I want to go and edit my dashboard. And the reason I want to edit my dashboard, so these are my 3 reports. So this is one report, next report, and the last one, is once I've added these reports, you'll notice in our right panel, there's a parameters menu. And that parameters menu allows me to select how I want the dashboard to treat any non-hidden, or in this case, prompting parameters on the dashboard. So I can allow a user on the output to change a value so they don't have to rerun the dashboard. I could prompt for a value before the user runs a dashboard, or I could do both. And in this case, I've set a default value here. So this dashboard starts out running on this particular date. I just chose a date that worked with my data. You can also change how the text for prompting is displayed, so that way you can give a nice user-friendly prompt on your dashboard. So now when I run a dashboard, what this looks like is it just runs automatically. Since I didn't check prompt for value, it doesn't prompt me before running the dashboard, but it does give me a new icon here on the left as I bring my mouse over the dashboard, and it says show parameter. And what you'll notice is that this value here appears. As I scroll over it, you'll see a light blue checker box appear around the reports that it controls. In this case, it really controls all the reports on the dashboard. And then if I want to, I can change the date, and it will rerun the report. You'll notice this updated the display in the formula, as well as some of the data, meaning it changed all of the filters as well. So in this way, instead of selecting 3 prompting filters, one for order date, one for required date, and one for ship date, I can choose a single parameter value, and that value will be passed to all of the filters. All right. Looks like another question came in. Is it possible to show some parameters while hiding others? That's a great question. So the question here is, could you show some parameters and hide others? And the answer is absolutely. So in our parameters, each one has its own hidden property. So you can take advantage of some parameters as prompting, user-facing parameters, and others as behind-the-scenes kind of parameters. Not only can you do that, that's a great example, that's a great segue into our next example, because our next example, we're going to look at some parameters that you wouldn't want the user to display or choose the value of. Before I jump into that next example, though, just want to give you guys a moment. Are there any other questions here on how we set the parameter to be non-hidden, or how we set the parameter to prompt here? Okay, don't see any other questions coming in. The last thing I'll note, though I don't have an example here set up, if we wanted to, as a report prompts, provide a drop-down of values in the prompting parameter menu, we can do that by using this parameter drop-down object property here. And we could select a data source and something from our database like a table or a view that provides a list of values for that specific parameter. So here, as an example, if I ran this report, I'm prompted for a value, we could have a drop-down, similar to how your users are accustomed to filter drop-downs in Exago already. Great, so a couple of questions came in. Just give me one moment here. Oh, a great question was going back to the user ID and company ID parameters, what was their use? And so there are a couple of uses in these parameters. These are the user ID and company ID. So these are parameters Exago behind the scenes will automatically look for and use in storing schedules and showing schedules to a user. They're also used in things like folder management and other extensibility features. And we're going to look at an example of using a parameter in such a case in just a moment. Yeah, so I mentioned this parameter dropdown object, and the question came in, could such a dropdown come from our database, our data source? And the answer is yes. You can have parameters provide a list of possible values to select from coming from your data source. So that's actually what we do here. Great. So I'm going to move over to example 3 here. So the last example is going to be on how parameters can be used by extensibility. This is one of a very common way of using parameters. And we're going to have 2 sort of mini examples in here. So the first one is you want to keep an audit trail of report executions, but you only want to track certain users. Our use case in-house here is that I run a lot of reports in our system. So we don't want to keep an audit trail of our internal folks, but maybe I want to keep track of my colleague Emma. If she's running reports, I want to know which reports are being run, right? So we'll show how that can be done. And the second one, very similar. We want to create a custom dialog to share reports, but we only want to give certain users access to that dialog. So similarly, we want to use some other extensibility features in Exago. In the first server event, and in the second case, we're going to use an action event. But in both cases, we only want those extensibility features to apply to certain users. Parameters are a great way to do that. So what I'll do here is in our admin console, I'll just note that we have a server event called record executions. It's calling some code from our DLL, so we're going to jump into Visual Studio in just a moment. And what we can do is we can set this server event to run whenever a report execution starts. Makes sense. If we're recording executions, we probably want to do it when one starts. We also have an action event called on tree node right click set right click menu. That's kind of a mouthful, but what it means is when a user clicks on a report or folder here in our left menu, we call that a tree, we want to set what this menu looks like. So, if you click on this hamburger menu, what options are available here? I'm actually going to, so we're not going to go too deep on how this is done. That's going to be a future lab at some point. But what I want to do is show how these two server and action events can be tailored to only apply to specific users. So in the parameters menu, we've created two new parameters. So we've created one here called record executions and one called show sharing. I like to keep the naming as simple as possible. And in this case, both parameters are hidden, so the user doesn't get to change them because these are user permissions. They shouldn't be something the user can decide. And they're just going to be a simple string with the word true or the word false. Right? Before I jump into the code, does anyone have any questions on these two parameters? Okay, great. Don't see any questions coming in. So what we're going to do is jump over to our extensibility, and we have a method here called record execute start. This is the one we've told Exago in the admin console to call whenever a report execution starts. And the key here is that Exago is going to pass in what's called the session info object. This gives the extensibility feature, in this case the server event, an understanding of all of the values in Exago's configuration for that specific user. And in our case, the key part here is right at the beginning of the method. What we're going to do is we're going to use the session info object, and we're going to call get parameter, and we're going to go get that record execution parameter. So this is going to give us that value, and then we're going to parse it, so we're going to turn it into a Boolean, so essentially just tell the code true or false. And what you'll notice is the rest of our method is wrapped in an if. So it essentially says, if this parameter says to record executions, do a bunch of stuff. Otherwise, don't do anything. Just return null, carry on your business. In our case, in this first case, a bunch of stuff means write a record to the database showing that a particular user ran a particular report at that time. And you'll notice here actually that we are using our user ID parameter as well. So in this case, sessioninfo.userid is essentially just a shortcut to get the parameter user ID. So we're actually making use of two parameters in this extensibility feature, but in terms of deciding who we should record executions for and who we shouldn't, this is really the key for our server. Our action event is going to follow a very similar style. So we have our action event is calling this method here. Again, we're passing in the session info object, and right at the start, we're parsing, we're finding that show sharing method, we're parsing it into a Boolean, and then we're wrapping the rest of our method in an if to say, hey, if show sharing says to do so, do some stuff. Otherwise, return null, carry on with the default behavior. I'm not going to dive too much into how this action event works because that's going to be a future lab topic. So I just want to pause there. Does everyone see how you can use parameters within extensibility features like server events, action events, custom functions, and folder management to identify properties or even identify individual users? Okay, don't see any questions coming in there, so that seems good. So jumping back to our presentation here, That's going to cover our extensibility scenarios. There are a lot of other uses of parameters, and for the sake of time today, we're not going to dive into each and every one, but I will list out a couple so that you can see them. So we did mention displaying parameters on a report on the output. Parameters can also be used for multi-tenant values. We've actually covered multi-tenanting in a previous lab, so if you want to go back and watch that lab, you'll see the use of parameters throughout multi-tenanting. They can be used within custom SQL objects as well as programmable data sources and data objects such as stored procedures or .NET assemblies. Again, we have a previous support lab on that. My colleague Nick gave a great overview of stored procs, and you can see the use of parameters there as well. You can use them within custom functions that would be very similar to the server and action events we've shown here. And they can be used within scheduler settings. So in the admin console, you can set the default subject and body of a scheduled report. And within that default, you can place parameters. Those will be filled in for the user. So if you wanted to have your default scheduler subject say something like, your report is ready and sent to you by, and the user, you could have a non-hidden parameter that provides the user's name, and it would appear there as well. Great. One of my colleagues is telling me that there's a good question here, so let me see 1 second for questions. Yeah, so a question came in back on the second example. Could you use a parameter during a prompt rather than on a dashboard? And the answer is yes. So let me show that here. So on my dashboard, when we were editing the dashboard, not only can you have it appear on the output like we saw here, but you can also check prompt for value so that the parameter prompts before the report is run and displays for the user. So you have those options here. So with that, that was a very brief overview of parameters. They're a very flexible tool and sort of, they're kind of like the nails of a building. You can use them in a lot of different places and they're very useful there. So what I want to do is say, of course, thanks for coming. And if you do have questions, please feel free. We're always happy to stick around for a few moments. But we do have some exciting things coming up. So for our upcoming labs, normally at the end of each lab we have a vote, but we've decided a couple coming up for a few reasons. So this June, it's going to be all about scheduling reports. So some of my colleague Nick Cortina is going to cover scheduling both from a front end. So as a user, how do you schedule and email reports and what are your options? And as an administrator, how do you install the schedule? How do you configure it? What are some key considerations? And then in July, my colleague Emma is going to be just showcasing one of our new features in our 18.1 release, which will be formulas in the Express views, which we're really excited about. Very cool, very useful feature there. And then I'm going to be covering batch REST API calls. So if you're using the REST API or you're thinking about using the REST API, this is a really cool way to batch together a number of calls and improve the performance of launching Exago using the REST API. The other important things to know are our 2018.1 release. Of course, we have a release webinar, so we're releasing on June 4th is our major GA release for 18.1, and shortly thereafter, the date's still TBD, we'll have a release webinar where we cover all the new features in Exago. And if you haven't checked it out already, if you like hearing about data and BI and reporting, we do have a podcast. So if you're interested, I definitely recommend you check it out. It's called Data Talks. It's very cool. It's run by one of our colleagues here at Exago. It's not very Exago specific. It's a lot more about the industry, but you can always get a lot out of it and hear from some cool folks working on reporting and BI and data. So with that, a few more questions have come in, so I just want to take a moment and pause and make sure we've answered everyone's questions. A great question came out. When is the 18.1 release date? So the release date is going to be June 4th. So the release webinar will be sometime in probably a week or so after that. We like to give a few days just to get our hands from the presenting side and make sure that everyone can try it out before the webinar there. So with that, I just want to say thank you very much for attending, and we hope to see you in June for our upcoming webinars, and happy reporting.